Proud supporters of Africa this week. Engine. With us, you are number one.
Ghana this week revised its 2010 public deficit up to 6.8% of output from a previous estimate of 3.7% and signaled the current year deficit would likely be adjusted too. Oil is expected to help drive Ghana's economic growth into the double digits this year, shoring up its transformation from an aid-reliant country to one on par with mid-income nations like Egypt or Iran. CNBC Africa spoke to Otto Hughes, partner at Iroko Capital.
7.7% definitely were the numbers for last year, which compared to your 09 numbers were almost 2 times what that was. Now, if you look at what's happening so far the first quarter this year, gold production, cocoa, and of course oil, not even counting the basic agriculture, are all up big numbers. So far, for the first quarter of the year, the country has exported over $3 billion. Of which $500 million is from crude. That compares to $1.9 billion of exports from last year. So ex-crude, you are seeing growth of literally 25% in exports of those base items. So we definitely are expecting solid mid-teens growth rates for 2011 for the country economy as a whole.
Let's talk about some of those forecasts. I mean, a figure that's been bandied about for this year and next year is GDP of 12%, buoyed, as you're indicating, by the oil sector and the fact that later on you're hoping as Ghana to start producing a lot more for the international market. 12%, is that a realistic figure though?
I think it is, because if you look at over the last 18 months, cocoa prices haven't moved much. They've stayed around the 3,000 metric ton level, and you're still seeing huge improvements in the sales of cocoa and cocoa products. What is happening is the countries are attracting more FDI. So instead of just selling your primary beans and similar products, more processed goods are being sold, and that is adding to the overall growth of the economy. One thing too to pay attention to is if you look at the past 5 years, as a percentage of overall GDP, your services, your agriculture, and your manufacturing sectors have stayed relatively the same. Your services has accounted for 50% of GDP for the past 5 years. Hasn't really changed much. Agri has done 30, industrials has done 20. So the country continues to maintain a balance of growth across all these 3 primary sectors.
I mean, talking about oil, and let's talk about how it's going to be a key variable for growth this year. Obviously, at the moment, it's high oil prices, but they are stabilizing somewhat, and many are expecting the stability to mean a slight decline in the price of oil, but still above $100 a barrel. But there's a sense that Ghana needs to do much more by way of output and also by way of exploration, not just in oil but in gas. And a lot of that work means that you're not going to see the returns immediately.
Well, yes and no. I mean, you will not see it immediately necessarily on the export front, but you would see some of the returns of that on your services and other local development front, which I think is actually better for the economy, because then you begin to build a broader based economy and you begin to put in place routes and expertise, skill sets and services which provide for longer term growth. From that perspective then, as the oil kicks in, you would have a broader based sector, broader based economy, people with expertise in different areas, and hopefully you don't end up with a migration of everyone going to the oil sector, because they would have skills which are very valuable in other parts of the economy.
The improvement in Cote d'Ivoire's political stability will generate expectations among the population of a rapid improvement in living standards and the provision of public services. This ahead of the swearing-in of Olasanya Ouattara on the 21st of May. Dr. Petrus de Kock, senior researcher at the Governance of Africa's Resources Program at the South African Institute for International Affairs, spoke to us.
This has been a long road and a, excuse me, a very difficult one in the last few months. So as you say, it's the expected moment, but the job ahead is quite a big one. I think first in the order of priorities will be to get the basic essential services back online, the ones that have been disrupted by the conflict in the country in the last few months. But implied in that is also a very big question on what's going to happen at the level of the military structure in the country. I think there's a big question on the armed militias and groups still, small groups still allied to the former president. So the question will be a demobilization campaign. How will the military structure be adapted to suit the new political dispensation? And then also in terms of President Ouattara's new cabinet, how will he appoint certain positions and how will he basically allay certain fears of what's still quite a divided society?
What does nation building mean in a country like Cote d'Ivoire, not least because of the recent political situation we've seen, but also prior to the debacle around the elections? There was a lot of tribalism. Even Alassane Ouattara on 2 previous occasions couldn't contest the elections on the basis of questions around his nationality. Some of those issues, we're told, still persist in that country.
Yes, you are right. They do still persist. And I think that's also something that's linked to my earlier comment that not only do we have a very complex military or security situation, but at a social level, there's a huge job ahead in terms of establishing a kind of discourse in the country and a kind of understanding that can build trust between different groups. I think in the western part of the country, I came across some reports that there's a question about how will the groups that control the western part of the country feel about the political transition, and are there potential threats, security threats in that region. So I think taking a leaf from the book of reconciliation in South Africa, I think the deep work that has to be done is where President Ouattara, after he is sworn in, will have to show a willingness to engage with forces in the country that may not traditionally even like him or like the kind of groups that he is allied with. So I think in the sense of developing African politics or evolving African politics, the situation in Ivory Coast will have to be studied very carefully and also looked into how can one engage in meaningful processes of national reconciliation that doesn't only look at the surface phenomena but really addresses the root causes of the conflicts. Otherwise one will perpetually see the country's political evolution caught up within historical, one can say, trenches or historical conflicts.
All sides agree that immediately there's a need for economic revival. There's a need to get basic social services up and running again. There's an imperative to supply humanitarian assistance to people who've been displaced by the recent civil war. And it's also important to get public administration up and running. How are they going to get that all sorted?
Well, I think the only way of getting that sorted is to very quickly get on with the job. I think President Ouattara has indicated this. I think he didn't even grant leave to some of his staff who's been holed up with him in the hotel for about 4 months. So he's sending the signals that he is not only the right man for the job, but that he and his team have the energy to pursue the much needed reconstruction, as you say, getting the administration up and running. But I think what we must also remember is that President Gbagbo was in power for quite a long time, and he also entrenched himself in the administration of the country. So I think there's also going to be a complicated process of appointments in the civil service itself, and probably some political wrangling at the same time. And I think that is also where the big question of national reconciliation comes to the fore. How will people who have stared down at each other across the barrel of a gun until a few weeks ago, how will they engage in a political process to move the country forward outside of their own narrow political interests?
Renaissance Capital held its second Pan-African Investor Conference in Lagos, Nigeria this week. CNBC Africa's Wale Famurewa caught up with CEO Stephen Jennings and discussed a wide range of issues regarding Africa's growth potential as an emerging market.
It's very clear that Africa is the biggest opportunity globally now. 5 years ago, when we first came to Africa, we were, shall we say, bold enough to say that we thought Africa would become the fastest growing region in the world. The IMF is forecasting now that that would happen. So I think people understand the growth, but I don't think they understand how broadly based and how powerful that growth is going to be. And I think Africa will change gear again. I think Africa can grow considerably faster than anywhere else in the world, and there's so many signs of that now, but I don't think that is very well understood today. Yeah, most of the uncultivated arable land in the world is in Africa. We're clearly going to have a huge increase in demand for basic agricultural commodities. There's very limited, southern Russia, Ukraine, Africa are the only places in terms of land area that can satisfy that demand. What we've seen in other emerging markets, Brazil, but more recently Ukraine, where we're major players in agriculture, is very rapid transformation in terms of yields, productivity and output from the agricultural sector. With the stability you have in Africa and here in Nigeria, with the capital flows that you have, there's no reason that you can't enjoy the same success that countries like Brazil and Ukraine have enjoyed. And I think that will be one of the big surprise success stories over the next 5 years. You're starting to see it happen. It's happening from a very low base, but it doesn't mean to say it can't be quite transformational.
Rencap obviously is in the investment banking business. Talk to us about your expectations for deal flow going forward in Africa.
Yes. Yeah, we're an investment bank and we're an investor, so we own a lot of industrial assets and we're building a lot of non-investment banking businesses. But I think the deal flow will grow very rapidly with the kind of growth that you have in Africa, with the kind of growth you have here in Nigeria, for example. You'll have very rapid capital formulation. You'll have very rapid uptick in foreign capital flows. You'll have big build-up in foreign FDI. And having lived through these kind of transitions in some of the former Soviet economies, there's a tendency to underestimate how fast and how powerful those processes can be. So I don't know what will happen in the next 6 months, but over the next 3 to 5 years, the growth in the capital markets and in M&A will be phenomenal compared with what we see today, in my opinion.
Let's discuss modernization in Africa. To what extent do you think this will stunt the growth of the continent? Many obviously point to South Africa because of its strong institutions, level of development as the entry point to Africa. What are your thoughts on the impact that modernization would have on the quality of growth we'll see in the continent?
You know, I don't necessarily think that South Africa is the best entry point. South Africa has strengths, obvious strengths, but most of the growth is outside of South Africa. South Africa is growing slowly compared with the rest of the continent. You can have explosive growth in sub-Saharan Africa. To be successful here, you have to be local. So South Africa has its strengths and it has its weaknesses. In terms of modernisation, again, the issue is how quickly can these countries change? And I think, again, look at the election you've had in Nigeria compared with what we've had historically. No one's talking about it, but no one's talking about it because it went very smoothly. It's another stage in your development. Look at the kind of restructuring you've had of the banking sector here since the crisis. I think it's been of a very high quality. So that modernisation is happening and it's part of a virtuous cycle of economic modernisation and political development.